"Ma'am, hands on the hood. Now." The command cut through the quiet street like a blade, sharp and immediate, leaving no space for questions, only compliance. And Angela Brooks froze mid-step, the plastic hospital badge still clipped to her chest, her fingers tightening around the worn strap of her bag as the red and blue lights flickered against the storefront windows, painting the sidewalk in restless color while a passing car slowed just enough for the driver to glance, to notice, to judge, and then move on, because that was how moments like this worked: quick, uncomfortable, and then gone unless you were the one standing in the center of it, unless you were the one being told to stop. Angela exhaled slowly, steadying herself, her sneakers barely making a sound as she turned and placed her hands on the cool metal of the squad car, the surface still warm from the engine beneath it, the faint hum vibrating through her palms, while Officer Ryan Carter stepped closer, his boots firm against the pavement, his voice controlled but distant, like he had already decided who she was before she said a single word. "You match a description," he said, not unkindly, not loudly, just enough to make it sound official, enough to make it sound final, and Angela nodded once, not because she agreed, but because she understood the rhythm of moments like this, the way they moved whether you were ready or not. The click of the handcuffs came quick, precise, the metal cool against her wrists, and for a second her breath caught, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of it, the finality of that sound echoing louder than it should have in the open air as a few people gathered at a distance, phones lifting, whispers forming, quiet but present. Her bag slipped from her shoulder, falling softly to the ground, the zipper half open, revealing the edge of a folded scrub cap, a stethoscope glinting under the streetlight, and a photograph tucked into the side pocket, barely visible, the corner worn from being handled too many times. "Officer," Angela said gently, her voice calm despite the tightness in her chest. "I just finished a 12-hour shift at Mercy General. I'm heading home." Carter didn't respond right away, his gaze moving from her face to the bag, then back again, something unreadable flickering in his expression before settling into something firmer, something practiced. "Turn around," he instructed, guiding her toward the open back door of the cruiser, the interior dim, the faint smell of vinyl and rain lingering in the air as the first drops began to fall, soft at first, then steadier, tapping against the roof of the car, sliding down the windows in thin, uneven lines. Angela blinked against it, unsure if the moisture on her face was from the rain or something else, her shoulders squared, her posture steady even as the world around her shifted, even as the murmurs grew louder, even as the moment stretched longer than it should have. Then, just as Carter reached for the door, a black SUV pulled up hard along the curb, tires hissing against the wet pavement, the engine idling low and controlled, and the door opened with quiet precision as a man stepped out, his suit dark against the streetlights, his presence immediate without needing to raise his voice. And when his eyes lifted and found Angela, everything seemed to pause, not dramatically, not loudly, but in that subtle way the air changes when something important is about to happen. And for the first time since the cuffs closed around her wrists, Officer Carter hesitated. The man did not rush, did not speak right away, and that was what made the shift in the air feel heavier, more deliberate, as his polished shoes met the wet pavement with quiet certainty, and the faint glow of a badge clipped at his belt caught the streetlight for just a second before disappearing again into shadow, and Angela felt her breath steady without knowing why, her eyes fixed on him as recognition flickered somewhere deep, not of who he was exactly, but of what he carried with him, a presence that did not belong to bystanders or late-night passers-by. Officer Carter straightened slightly, his hand still resting on the open car door, his posture tightening as if some instinct had begun to signal caution. "Sir, this is an active situation," he said, his voice measured but no longer as certain as before. And the man nodded once, acknowledging the words without stepping back, his gaze shifting briefly to Angela's wrists, to the cuffs, then back to her face, taking in the details others had overlooked, the hospital badge, the faint crease in her scrubs from hours of movement, the quiet composure she had held onto even now. The rain grew steadier, tapping against the hood of the cruiser in a soft, relentless rhythm. And somewhere behind them a car door shut, a voice murmured, the world continuing. as it always did while this moment stretched thin between decision and consequence. Angela swallowed, her voice low but steady. I told him I just got off shift, she said, not pleading, not raising her tone, just stating what was real, and the man's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something sharpening behind his eyes as he turned his attention back to Carter. On what grounds? He asked, calm, precise. The kind of question that did not need volume to carry weight, and Carter hesitated. For half a second, just enough for it to be noticed. Suspicious behavior matching a report. He replied, the words sounding practiced, but thinner now, less anchored than before. The man stepped closer, not aggressively, not invading, just enough to close the distance, his presence filling the space with a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself. And Angela felt the cold metal at her wrists again, the slight ache beginning to form, grounding her in the reality of where she stood. Even as something else began to shift around her, a gust of wind pushed the rain sideways, catching the edge of her sleeve, and Carter glanced down briefly, noticing the stethoscope lying on the pavement, the photograph half exposed, the details that had been there all along but had not mattered until now. And when he looked back up, the man was already watching him, not with anger, not yet, but with a focus that made it clear this moment was no longer simple. Turn her around, the man said. Quietly, not a demand, not quite, but something closer to expectation, and for a second Carter did not move, the pause stretching just long enough for the tension to become visible for the watching phones, to hold steadier, for the rain to sound louder against the metal surfaces around them. And then Carter shifted, his hand lowering slightly from the door, his certainty no longer as complete as it had been minutes ago, and Angela felt the smallest change in the air, like the first crack in something that had seemed solid only moments before. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt loaded, like something unseen had stepped into the space between them and was now waiting to be acknowledged. And Angela slowly turned as instructed, the cuffs shifting slightly around her wrists, the metal no longer just cold but present, heavy with implication, while Officer Carter adjusted his stance, his movements more careful now, more aware, as if each action carried a weight it had not carried before, and the man from the SUV watched. It all without interruption, his eyes steady, absorbing every detail, every hesitation, every word left unsaid. You said she matched a description, he repeated, not louder, not sharper, but clearer, the kind of clarity that made vague answers harder to hide behind, and Carter nodded once, though the motion lacked its earlier certainty. Yes, sir, we had a call come in about someone loitering in the area, acting out of place, he replied, his gaze briefly shifting toward the small crowd that had formed, as if hoping the explanation would settle the moment back into something routine, something manageable. Angela stood still, rain tracing quiet lines down her sleeves, her breathing even, her shoulders squared not in defiance but in dignity, and the man glanced down again, this time deliberately, noticing the hospital badge more closely, the name clearly printed, the department listed beneath it, the subtle marks of long hours etched into the fabric of her scrubs, details that told a story without needing to be spoken aloud. Out of place, he echoed softly, and there was something in the way he said it that made the phrase sound thinner than it had a moment ago, like it had lost its strength under inspection, and Carter shifted again, the tension in his jaw tightening, just slightly, as he realized the conversation was no longer moving in the direction he expected. A car passed slowly, tires cutting through the wet street, headlights sweeping briefly across the scene before continuing on, and for a second the light caught the photograph on the ground, illuminating the image just enough to reveal a younger version of the man now standing there, dressed in a graduation gown, standing beside Angela, both of them smiling in a way that felt distant from the present moment, untouched by suspicion or interruption. The man's gaze flickered to it, and something changed, not outwardly dramatic, but internal, a quiet confirmation settling into place as he bent slightly, retrieving the photograph with careful fingers, brushing the rain from its surface before holding it up just enough for Carter to see. You might want to look at this, he said, his tone still calm, still measured, but now carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. And Carter leaned in just slightly, his eyes scanning the image, recognition not immediate, but building, piece by piece, as he looked from the photograph to the man, then back again. Angela watched the exchange, her pulse steady but present, the moment stretching in that fragile space between what had been assumed and what was now beginning to be understood, and the man straightened, the photograph still in his hand, his gaze returning to Carter with a quiet intensity that did not need to raise its volume to be felt. "Her name is Angela Brooks," he said, each word deliberate, grounded. "And you need to be very clear about why she is standing here in cuffs." And for the first time since the lights had started flashing, Officer Carter did not respond right away, the pause longer now, more visible, as the certainty he had relied on began to slip, leaving behind something far less stable in its place. The rain did not stop, it only grew steadier, each drop layering over the last until the sound became a constant presence, soft but impossible to ignore, like the tension that now settled between them. And Officer Carter cleared his throat, shifting his weight as if trying to reset the moment, to bring it back under control. But the control had already slipped, inch by inch, word by word. "Sir, I followed procedure," he said, more carefully now, each syllable chosen with intention, but the confidence behind it no longer solid, no longer unquestioned. And the man watched him without interruption, his gaze unwavering, the photograph still held between his fingers, the image of a younger life now standing quietly against the reality unfolding in front of them. Angela remained still, her wrists steady despite the faint pressure of the cuffs, her breathing measured, her eyes moving only slightly between the two men, not searching for rescue, not expecting it, but aware that something had shifted, something that could not be undone by simply closing the car door and driving away. "Procedure begins with clarity," the man said after a moment, his voice even, almost quiet, but carrying a weight that seemed to settle into the space around them. "And clarity requires more than a feeling." And Carter's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes flickering toward the gathered phones. Again, the small crowd now closer, more attentive, the glow of screens reflecting the moment back at itself, amplifying it, preserving it. A drop of water slid from the edge of the cruiser roof, falling between them, and Carter glanced down again, this time at Angela's bag, the stethoscope resting against the pavement, the small details that now refused to stay invisible. And when he looked back up, his posture had changed just enough to be noticed, a fraction less rigid, a fraction more uncertain. "She was pacing," he added, as if searching for something to anchor his decision, back and forth near the storefront, looking around. And Angela's voice came softly in response, not raised, not defensive, just present. "I was waiting for my ride," she said, her words simple, grounded, and for a moment the explanation hung there, uncomplicated, unembellished, and harder to dismiss than anything else that had been said. The man nodded once, absorbing it, then stepped slightly to the side, his movement subtle but deliberate, placing himself where both Angela and Carter remained in his line of sight, as if ensuring that nothing in this moment would go unseen, unacknowledged. "What time did the call come in?" he asked, and Carter hesitated again, reaching instinctively toward his radio, then stopping, as if realizing that the answer itself now mattered more than the act of giving it. "Approximately 10 minutes ago," he replied, and the man glanced at his watch, the motion small but precise, the kind that suggested he was measuring more than just minutes. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed faintly, blending with the steady rain, a reminder that the city continued beyond this moment. But here, right here, time felt slower, heavier, as if every second carried consequence. Angela shifted her weight slightly, the cuffs moving just enough to remind her of their presence, and she lifted her chin a fraction, her voice calm. "My shift ended at 11:45, she said. "I walked 2 blocks and stopped here." And Carter's eyes moved to her again, this time not scanning, not assessing, but listening, really listening. And that change, small as it was, marked something deeper than any command or instruction. The man looked between them once more, the photograph still in his hand, the rain softening its edges. And then he spoke again, his tone unchanged but his words cutting more cleanly through the moment. "Then we are going to take this one step at a time," he said. "Because right now, the only thing that is clear is that this situation is no longer what it appeared to be. And for the first time since the night began to unravel, Officer Carter did not try to correct him, did not try to regain ground. He simply stood there, the weight of the moment settling fully onto his shoulders as the sound of the rain filled the silence he could no longer control. The air felt tighter now, not louder, not chaotic, but compressed, like every movement carried more consequence than before, and Officer Carter finally exhaled, a slow breath that seemed to mark the moment his certainty gave way to something heavier, something harder to ignore, as he reached for his radio again, this time actually pressing it, his voice lower than before, more controlled. "Dispatch. Can you confirm the original call details?" he said, each word measured, careful, as if aware that every syllable now mattered beyond routine procedure, and the faint static answered back before a voice responded, distant but clear enough to cut through the rain, listing the vague description that had started it all, the kind that could fit too many people, the kind that relied more on assumption than fact. Angela stood quietly, her shoulders relaxed but firm, her gaze steady ahead, not on Carter, not on the man beside him, but somewhere beyond, as if she had learned long ago that holding yourself together in moments like this required looking past them, not into them. And the man watched her for a second, something almost imperceptible softening in his expression before he turned back to Carter. "You hear that?" he said calmly, not as an accusation, but as a fact placed gently into the space between them, and Carter nodded once, his jaw tightening, the radio still in his hand as the realization settled in, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, unavoidable. A car passed again. Slower this time, headlights lingering just a fraction longer on the scene, illuminating the small details that now carried weight, the hospital badge, the rain on Angela's sleeves, the photograph still in the man's hand, and Carter finally looked at her directly, really looked this time, his eyes no longer scanning for confirmation of suspicion, but searching for something else, something he had missed earlier. "You said Mercy General," he repeated, quieter now, and Angela nodded once. "Yes. Cardiac unit," she replied, her voice even, grounded, and for a moment nothing else was said, the silence stretching, filled only by the sound of rain tapping against metal and pavement. The man stepped slightly closer, not interrupting, just present, his posture steady, his presence anchoring the moment as it shifted further away from what it had been, and Carter lowered his radio slowly. The movement small but significant, as if setting aside the last piece of the certainty he had relied on. "I am going to verify your identification," he said, the words formal, but different now, no longer edged with assumption, and Angela nodded again, offering no resistance, no frustration, just a quiet acceptance of the process as it should have been from the start. He crouched briefly, picking up her bag, the stethoscope brushing lightly against his hand, the cool metal a stark contrast to the warmth of the moment unfolding, and he opened the outer pocket carefully, retrieving her identification, the card catching the streetlight as he held it up, reading the name, the credentials, the confirmation of everything she had already said, everything that had been there from the beginning, waiting to be seen. The man watched without speaking, his eyes steady, his silence now heavier than any words, and Carter straightened slowly, the identification still in his hand, his expression no longer guarded, no longer certain, but something else entirely, something closer to understanding, and the rain continued to fall, steady and unrelenting, as the moment reached a point where it could no longer return to what it had been, where the weight of what had happened settled fully into place, and, for the first time, Officer Carter did not look like the one in control. He looked like the one standing at the edge of a realization he could not step away from. The moment stretched into something quieter now, not because the tension was gone, but because it had changed shape, settling deeper instead of pressing outward, and Officer Carter stood there with Angela's identification still in his hand, the edges of the card damp from the rain, his eyes fixed on the printed details as if reading them again might somehow alter what they meant, but it did not. It only confirmed what had already been said, what had already been visible, what had been overlooked, and slowly, almost carefully, he lowered the card, his gaze lifting back to Angela, meeting her eyes without the filter of suspicion for the first time. And there was a pause, a real pause, not hesitation, but recognition, the kind that arrives quietly and stays. The rain softened slightly, no longer striking the pavement with the same urgency, now a steady whisper against the metal surfaces around them. And the man beside them remained still, his presence unchanged, but his silence now carried a different weight, no longer waiting, but witnessing. As Carter took a small step forward, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, just present in a way it had not been before. "Ms. Brooks," he said, her name spoken clearly, respectfully, as if saying it correctly mattered now. And Angela held his gaze, not challenging, not forgiving, simply there, grounded, her composure intact despite everything that had unfolded. Carter glanced down briefly at the cuffs around her wrists, the metal catching the dim light, and for a moment he did not move, as if understanding that this next action would carry more meaning than the one that placed them there. And then, slowly, he reached forward, the motion deliberate, measured, the quiet click of the mechanism releasing, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, and the cuffs loosened, falling away from her wrists, leaving behind only the faint impression of their presence. Angela lowered her hands gently, rubbing one wrist with the other, not out of discomfort alone, but as if reminding herself that the moment had shifted, that something had changed, even if the feeling of it lingered. The small crowd remained at a distance, quieter now, the phone still raised but the murmurs subdued, as if the weight of what they had just witnessed had settled into them as well. And Carter stepped back slightly, giving her space, the identification still in his hand for a second longer before he extended it toward her, his voice steady but different now, stripped of the certainty it once carried. "You are free to go," he said, and the words landed softly, not as a resolution, not as closure, but as an acknowledgement of what should have been clear from the beginning. Angela took the card, her fingers steady, her movements calm, and she nodded once, not in gratitude, not in acceptance, but in recognition, the same quiet recognition that had passed between them moments earlier. The man finally stepped closer, just enough to stand beside her, his presence no longer separate from hers. And for a second he looked at Carter, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something heavier, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood, and Carter met that look, holding it for a moment before lowering his gaze, the shift small but undeniable. The rain continued its quiet rhythm, the lights still flashing, the street unchanged and yet completely different, and Angela adjusted her bag, the stethoscope now tucked safely inside. The photograph returned to its place, and she stood there for a second longer, breathing, steady, present, before taking a step away from the car, the sound of her sneakers against the wet pavement soft but certain, leaving behind a moment that could not be undone, only carried forward. Angela had taken only a few steps when the sound of the rain seemed to soften even more, as if the world itself had leaned back to watch what would happen next, and she stopped, not because she was unsure, but because something in the silence behind her felt unfinished, like a sentence that had not reached its final word, and slowly, she turned her head just enough to glance back, her eyes not searching for confrontation, not expecting anything, but aware that moments like this rarely ended as simply as they appeared. Officer Carter still stood near the cruiser, the flashing lights reflecting across his uniform in restless patterns, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defined by authority, but by something quieter, heavier, the kind of stillness that comes when realization settles in fully. And for a brief second, he looked at her again, not as a figure in a situation, but as a person he had misread, and the weight of that misreading hung in the space between them. The man stepped forward beside Angela, his presence calm but undeniable, and this time, when he spoke, his voice carried not just control, but clarity. "Officer," he said, steady, measured, and Carter straightened instinctively, though the movement lacked the certainty it once had. "Yes, sir," he replied, his tone respectful now, attentive in a way that marked the shift that had already taken place. The man reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, and for a moment nothing moved except the rain tracing its quiet path along the edges of the car, and then he produced a badge, holding it just enough for Carter to see, the emblem catching the light in a brief, unmistakable flash, and the air seemed to tighten again, not with tension, but with recognition, as Carter's eyes focused on it. the details registering one by one, the kind of recognition that did not require explanation, only acknowledgement. Angela watched without speaking, her expression steady, her breathing even, as if she had learned long ago that truth did not need to rush, it only needed to stand. Daniel Brooks, the man said simply, lowering the badge but not the weight behind it. Internal affairs. And the words did not echo, they did not need to. They settled into the moment with quiet finality, reshaping everything that had come before, and Carter's shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly, the last traces of assumption giving way to something far more grounded, far more real. A faint sound came from the small crowd, a murmur, a reaction not loud enough to disrupt the moment, but present enough to remind everyone watching that what had just unfolded was not ordinary, not forgettable, and Carter glanced briefly toward them before returning his focus to Daniel, his expression composed but altered, the weight of the situation now fully understood. "I was responding to a call," Carter said, more carefully now, each word placed with intention, but the explanation felt different this time, not defensive, not assertive, just factual, as if he had moved from justification to acknowledgement, and Daniel nodded once, not dismissing it, not challenging it, but holding it in place, letting it exist without allowing it to define the outcome. Angela shifted her bag slightly on her shoulder, the familiar weight grounding her, the rhythm of her breath steady against the lingering tension in the air, and she stood there between them, not as the center of conflict anymore, but as the quiet proof of what had been overlooked, what had been misjudged, and what had now been seen. The rain continued to fall, soft and steady, the lights still flashing against the wet pavement, and for a moment, no one spoke, the silence settling into something deeper than before, something that did not demand resolution, but carried the understanding that whatever came next would not erase what had already happened, only define what it meant. The rain carried on in a quiet, steady rhythm, no longer sharp or intrusive, but constant, like a reminder that time had not stopped, even if everything in this moment had slowed to a near standstill. And Officer Carter stood there with Daniel's words settling into him, not as a shock, but as something heavier, something that required him to look at the situation from a place he had not considered before. And for a few seconds he said nothing, his gaze shifting briefly to Angela, then back to Daniel, as if trying to align what he had assumed with what now stood clearly in front of him. "Internal affairs," he repeated under his breath, not questioning, just acknowledging, and Daniel did not respond right away, his posture unchanged, his presence calm, giving the silence space to do its work, to let understanding settle without forcing it, and Angela remained still between them, her shoulders relaxed but her stance grounded, her eyes moving once from Daniel to Carter, not searching for reaction, but simply observing, as if she had learned that what people did next mattered more than anything they said. Carter finally shifted his weight, a small movement, but enough to signal that something inside him had moved as well. "I followed the call as it came in," he said again, quieter this time, not repeating for defense, but for clarity, as if retracing his steps might help him understand where the line had blurred. And Daniel nodded once, not dismissing it, but not allowing it to stand alone either. "And now you are seeing more than the call," he replied, his tone even, not accusatory, just firm, and that distinction mattered. It left no room for argument, only for reflection. The flashing lights continued to cast shifting colors across the wet pavement, reflecting in the puddles at their feet, distorting the scene into fragments of red and blue that moved with every drop of rain. And Carter glanced down briefly, as if grounding himself, before lifting his gaze again, this time holding it steady, not avoiding, not deflecting, and there was something in that moment, something quiet but significant, the first real step from reaction to responsibility. Angela adjusted the strap of her bag slightly, the motion small, habitual, her fingers brushing against the fabric where the stethoscope rested inside, and she exhaled slowly, her breath visible for a second in the cooler air, not because she was shaken, but because she was present, fully present in a moment that could have easily gone unseen, unheard, unchallenged. Daniel watched Carter closely, not pressing, not escalating, just allowing the weight of the situation to remain where it belonged. And after a pause that felt longer than it was, Carter spoke again, his voice steady, but different, stripped of assumption, grounded in something more deliberate. "I understand," he said, and the words were simple, almost understated, but they carried more meaning now than any explanation he had given before, because they were not about what he had done. They were about what he now saw. The small crowd had grown quieter, the phone still raised, but the murmurs gone, replaced by a kind of shared stillness, as if everyone present recognized that this was no longer just a moment to watch, but a moment to absorb. And the rain continued to fall, soft, consistent, washing over the scene without interruption, as Carter took a slow breath and nodded once more, not to Daniel, not to Angela, but to the moment itself, acknowledging it, accepting it. And in that quiet acknowledgement, something shifted again, not outwardly dramatic, but deeply real, a recognition that what had happened could not be undone, only understood, and that understanding would shape everything that came next. The rain eased into a fine mist, the kind that blurred the edges of streetlights and softened every reflection on the pavement. And for a moment the flashing red and blue seemed less urgent, less dominant, as if even the lights had stepped back from the weight of what had just unfolded. And Angela stood there with her bag settled against her shoulder, her hands free now, her posture unchanged, steady, composed. The faint imprint of the cuffs already fading from her wrists, but not from the moment itself, and Daniel remained beside her, not shielding, not intervening, simply present, his gaze calm, his stance quiet but firm, as if he understood that the final part of this moment did not belong to authority, but to choice. Officer Carter took a slow breath, the sound barely audible beneath the soft rain, and he looked at Angela again, not searching this time, not questioning, just looking, and something in his expression shifted further, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. A recognition that went beyond the situation, beyond the report, beyond the assumptions that had brought them here. And for a second he seemed to consider his words carefully, weighing them against everything that had already happened, before speaking in a voice that no longer carried command, only clarity. "Ms. Brooks," he said again, quieter now, "you should not have been placed in that position tonight." And the sentence settled into the air with a different kind of weight, not an excuse, not a defense, but an acknowledgement that could not undo what had been done. "Only name it honestly." Angela listened, her eyes steady on him, her expression unchanged, not hardened, not softened, simply present, and she gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as closure, but as recognition of the truth in his words. And then she shifted her gaze briefly toward Daniel, a glance that held years behind it, shared understanding, quiet strength, before returning to the moment at hand. The small crowd had grown still, the phones lowering slightly now, as if the need to capture the moment had been replaced by the need to witness it fully. And Carter glanced around them once, taking in the scene he had helped create, the reflections in the wet pavement, the lingering attention, the quiet tension that had not fully left. And then he stepped back, just one step, but enough to change the space, to return it to something more balanced, less controlled, more human. Daniel inclined his head slightly, not in approval, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement. And for a brief moment the three of them stood in a line that felt less like opposition and more like understanding, however incomplete it might be. And Angela adjusted the strap of her bag once more, the motion, small, familiar, grounding, before turning fully away this time, her steps measured, unhurried, her presence leaving the center of the scene without resistance, without hesitation. The sound of her footsteps faded into the quiet rhythm of the mist, and Daniel remained still for a second longer, watching her go, before turning back to Carter, their eyes meeting once more, no words exchanged, none needed. And then he followed, his pace calm, deliberate, closing the distance without urgency, leaving behind a moment that had already begun to settle